Hey everybody, this is Perch, and this is a video that I hope you find informative, but I want to warn you, and we'll get to some more disclaimers here in a minute, that these are rough estimates, and they're also averages. Things are made to be broken, and you can come in here and point out a lot of cases where things move both faster and slower. But in all the talk of DC future state and in comics being made and responding to fan criticism and everything else, it's important to take note of the timeline of how these things get made and why you might not, in the world of internet instant gratification and immediate feedback from fans to creators and to companies, things aren't turn on a dime fast. So, how long does it take for comics to be produced? Well, to be clear, what we're talking about here is from initial pitch and concept to being held in the customer's hands. And this is a drawn out process. And this first initial pitch and concept can actually come about and be done in a lot of different ways. Now, like I said at the beginning, these are general timelines. They should be used as an average use case. Smaller companies, indie companies often work on an accelerated timeline. And some creators, writers, and artists operate faster or slower. One of the job of the editor is to determine whether their creative team actually operates faster and slower and adjusts the schedule accordingly. But this is a good general working average. Now, almost immediately as we get into this, there are, like I said, many exceptions. But you have to start from somewhere. Now, it's worth noting that none of this applies to crowdfunding or non-traditional distribution methods, which often happen much faster because you're an army of one, or sometimes slower because it's a vanity project that may be just taking more time. And as always, your mileage may vary. But again, it's important to start somewhere. So, what I'm going to call month zero are these creative gatherings, these writer summits. These have been in the news a bit, where Marvel or DC or others will gather in one location, and typically it's writers and editors, and they'll come together and they'll talk about big plans. The goal is to kind of get everyone loosely on the same page, to throw out ideas that may not work for your character but might work for somebody else's. And from the editorial level, talk about some big initiatives you want your company to get their arms around. Topics that have been talked about in the past include things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and how they want to tie into that, to a big creator coming in and doing something major with their line, and maybe some other people want to come on. Maybe it's to discuss different artists or different creative talents that might be coming in or might be freeing up and how that all works. And generally speaking, events and big things are done here. So, coming out of the writers or editorial summit, you often get comic storylines, you get event planning, you get relaunches and rebranding, you'll get discussion of line wide initiatives, and you get creative team planning. These are all things being discussed. These don't happen very often. They've happened sometimes twice a year, sometimes once a year, sometimes not even once a year. Right now at the X office, you're seeing a little bit more coordination amongst the writers, but generally speaking, at least in the past, this is where people would come together and talk big things. And the outcome of all this would be delivered as editorial and line guidance. Now, from here, from this point, month zero, this is when the comics actually start being thought through. In the first couple months, you typically have an initial pitch and an internal assignment. From the writer, you might pick the creative team, you might pick the artist, the colorist, you might pick other people, you might reaffirm that the team that you have on a comic is the one you want to keep going with for the next arc. And you'll do a budget check. How much cash do you have to produce this line of comics? If you're basically given a certain budget to produce 6 comics or 12 comics, you're trying to figure out, what do you want to do with the creative team? Do you want to use a maybe more expensive creative team for some of the issues and then go to a cheaper creative team for the rest in order to meet the budget? How do you kind of maximize the amount of dollars you're spending? And as an editor, you're typically managing several comics, not just one. So your budget and the trade-offs you're making between all of these, they matter. So this budget gets done, the creative team gets selected. Typically speaking, from that internal pitch, the internal alignment, to the creative team being selected and being ready to go, can take about 2 months. Now, this doesn't happen every comic. This just happens at the start of a run or start of a relaunch or some kind of general transition period from that creative summit that we talked about earlier to the idea that we want to relaunch a comic or do something new, to kind of getting the initial creative team selected. Now, this 2 months is where things can certainly speed up a lot. If the editor has a good relationship with the creative team, people they already know how to work with, this whole thing can be accelerated quite a bit. And generally speaking, at Marvel, that produces a lot of comics on almost a conveyor belt kind of mentality, this entire process is shortcutted when the editor is basically calling their friends, people within their network. They already know how it's going to work. By contrast, if you're talking about a big thing like what happened with Future State or some of DC's things, this whole process can take a lot longer. This idea of the internal pitch and alignment can take several months before everything kind of falls into place. Once this is done, the plot and the artwork could come together. Now, often speaking, writers are plotting out an issue usually faster than a month, but because a creative team selection can overlap with the creation of the plot and rewrites and other things that need to take place, a month timeline is not the worst idea in the world. A lot of writers will tell you that they're squeezed to do things a lot faster than this, but generally speaking, this is how different plots can come together. Keep in mind, most writers are writing more than one book, so that's also where these things stack up. Then the artwork, typically speaking, 22 pages, a page a day. Now, definitely some artists move faster and some move slower, but generally you want to budget about 22 days to a month for the artwork. And if the artist is doing both the penciling and the inking, that can also impact the time. From there, you get into the coloring, the lettering, and various revisions. Now, I have revisions coming here after coloring, but in all reality, revisions can creep much earlier in. But you see over the course of a comic that the coloring, the revision, the letterings, that all takes place over a little more than a month, often in the creation of the comic. And then you typically have the cover or the alternate covers coming in, often at the end, but sometimes earlier. It really kind of depends on when they get fit in. At some cases, if the artist that's doing the interior artwork is also doing the cover, that cover could come in the middle of that cycle. And editorial is there at the bottom, kind of hand-holding this entire process through. From there, we get about another month going through printing and distribution, and sometimes a little bit longer than this. That's typically a bit of alignment with the rest of the line, how things are going to come out, and often you can short circuit this quite a bit and make things go faster, at least in terms of the distribution. You can hotshot it out to market, but again, typically it's better to talk about a month. Finally, we're into the comic shop. Now, if you're looking at the bottom here, we're talking a little over 7 months from the internal pitch and assignment to actually in the comic shop for a new comic starting out fresh. So this is the first issue of a comic and often how it comes together. When we get to the second issue of the comic, it often overlaps like this. The plot is coming along pretty much as the artwork's being done for the first issue, and the artist, if they're continuing, is rolling right from the first issue to the second issue. But you see how all this is stacking up, getting into the comic shop a month later. This is generally speaking how comics are going, and this is actually the important point I wanted to make. So let me now switch over to a different picture to kind of illustrate what's going on here. If we're abstracting from a month 1 to a month 5, of the plot being completed, to the art coming together, to the issue going to the printer and distributor, and the first issue releasing to market, here's what we've got. We've cut out all that early work of the budget being created, the creative team being done, and I've compressed this timeline just a little bit to illustrate the point. So here's our first issue, and our second issue, and our third issue, and our fourth issue. Now, the important point to make here is look at that first issue there, releasing to market, and just follow vertically the line down. When the first issue is releasing to market, typically the second issue is already headed to the printer and distributor a little before it even gets into customers' hands. The third issue, the art is well underway, and we're into, at that point, the lettering and the coloring by the time it's in the comic shop. And finally, the fourth issue is really, by the time it's in the market, the plot is wrapping up. And generally speaking, a lot of writers write arcs kind of in bigger batches, so the plot is probably long done, and the artwork is getting started as the first issue is headed to market. What does all this mean? It means that market feedback on the comic arrives right down this line. Another way of putting this is you really don't know what your customers are going to think of this product and how it's going to be received until you're well 4 issues into the story. That's why at times some comics seem to take a long time to respond to reader feedback and kind of turn the ship around if things are off track. On average, we're talking about 8 months from initial pitch and concept to being held in the customer's hands for a first issue. Now, obviously, a second issue, third issue do speed up a little bit because you're not doing some of that early work. But this is basically what we're talking about. So, what do you make of this? Well, a couple of things to pull out of it. Like I said at the very beginning, and I'll say it again now, yes, this does vary from company to company and creator to creator, but this is a good rule of thumb to keep in your head if you're a fan and you're just trying to think about how comics are made. If you think about right now, you're probably watching this video. It was released in October. The comics were coming out, basically being produced in February. Now, we had a pandemic this year and a lot of other things are kind of crazy, but the initial ideas for a lot of what we're seeing were produced back in February. That's quite a while ago. And when you think about kind of, if an issue doesn't land or a creator gets into some trouble or something happens, this is how long it takes to kind of right the ship and turn things around. Now, there are exceptions. In the X-Men world, one of the artists, when they did the X-Men Gold launch, put some anti-Semitic things into the background of the comic, and 3 months later, they had gone ahead and replaced that artist. But there they had a little bit of an advantage. They were already planning to have a different artist on issue 4. They just didn't ask the initial artist back, so it wasn't as big of a hiccup or scheduling problem as you might think. But if you thought about things where, maybe creators have problems or artists have to suddenly leave a title or something goes on and there's schedule delays and shipping delays, it's this, kind of mechanics that is why. And if you think about the job of an editor, especially when an editor is stretched thin doing multiple comics, the coordination of getting all these things to market starts to be a pretty big deal and a pretty challenging job, which is why sometimes you see errors come through and other problems, and why it's not easy to just wave a wand and fix this stuff. A lot of cases, it's already downstream, too late to repair. At any rate, I hope this was helpful. So by all means, put some questions and comments below of what you think. Call me out if you disagree with this timeline. But I've vetted this now with 3 different editors, 2 writers, and 4 artists. So I feel pretty comfortable that this is generally kind of how it works on average. Again, lots of exceptions out there, but this is a good place to start. Anyway, leave your questions below, and hey, like, subscribe, dislike, whatever you'd like to do with the video, but hopefully this was informative, hopefully it's helpful, and hopefully gives you a little bit more insight into how comics get created and why things don't turn around quite as fast as you hope. At any rate, thanks for listening.